Hey everyone, it is late at night and I am Norman. It is October, so it's time for some more news. The first article I have comes from Monochrome Watches, and this is a piece on school watch projects. They're discussing a watch that a watchmaking student had built as a school project. This is a skeletonized watch with a single hand for the minutes and a sub-dial hand below the 12 o'clock that displays the hours. It's a crazy looking watch. What do I think of this? I had no idea that there was such a thing as school watch projects. That's pretty cool. I think I'll have to do a video discussing numerous school watch projects. Now that I know that it's an actual thing, I'm gonna have to track those down. So I imagine that the watches that come out of such a project would be pretty unique and interesting. These are students who are trying to make their mark and they're just now learning their craft. It'd be interesting to see what they come up with. I will definitely follow up with that. The next bit of news that I have comes from a blog to watch, and they're discussing some brand new chronographs that Timex has added to their Q lineup. What do I think of that? These chronographs look absolutely brilliant. Timex is doing some amazing things with its Q lineup. As you know, I had one of their tonneau shaped watches from that lineup, and it was absolutely amazing. A little bit too large for me, and I ended up getting a vintage piece from the 80s that kind of fills that niche. So I let that one go. But these chronographs are super cool looking. The colorways look great and they absolutely nailed a nice 70s aesthetic with them. You go, Timex. If you haven't checked out the Timex Q lineup, you definitely should. The next bit of news that I have comes from Crown and Caliber. This is an article on homages. The author discusses an homage that he had early on in his watch collecting days. It was an homage to the Omega Ploprof. You know, the big chunky dive watch that in a way reminds me of the Ripley watch. I think it's that side little bit there. Yeah. But he discusses how he ended up falling in love with the homage watch that he owned, even though it was an homage to a Grail watch of his at the time. It was his go-to watch for a long time and he beat the thing up and just absolutely loved it. However, in time he let it go, and later on he ended up purchasing a vintage Ploprof. However, being vintage, he almost felt like he had to baby it a bit. He couldn't really wear it as the rugged, tough watch that his homage was. And so that watch ended up going the way that the homage did. What is my take on this? As you know, I own a few homages, so I don't have beef with homages at all myself. I think it just depends on what you're after. An homage is not going to replace a Grail watch. If you're going for a Speedmaster, a Pagani design watch is not going to replace the Speedmaster for you. Although, after reading this article, you never know, because in his particular case, the homage almost did. But I think it's great having options. Not all of us are going to scrape and save to buy a certain watch, but we love the aesthetic enough to where a cheaper variant of it might be a viable option. Again, to mention the Speedmaster, I'm not really going to save and get a Speedmaster. They're way too large for me and they break too many of my personal rules. But I do love the aesthetic, and that's why I own a Pagani design moon watch, because it's fun to every now and then wear a watch that has that Speedmaster aesthetic to it. Same with Explorers. I absolutely love the Explorer aesthetic, so I think it's great that people like me, who are probably never ever going to actually go for an Explorer, can enjoy that aesthetic in watches like the Everest. Next up, we have an IWC from the 1990s. This is a blacked out watch with the dark dial, and it's surprisingly amazing. This is a Flieger style chronograph, and what do I think of it? I actually love this look. I love that blacked out look And with the details of the chronograph, I think it makes it look even cooler. And the watch looks absolutely brilliant on a green strap or even a beige one, which generally isn't a color that I go for. And even more shocking because this comes out of the 1990s. I do not like 1990s watches, especially if they really look like they came from the 1990s. You know, that decade where people were just adding meaningless sci-fi details to things, including watches. And if they weren't doing that, they were making them lumpy and weird looking. Not to mention that the 90s gave rise to the era of the giant watch. So, not my personal decade. But this watch, this IWC, looks absolutely awesome. By the way, that article was in Hodinkee.com. The next story comes from Watch Pro site. Apparently for $134,000, you can add a Daytona to the back of your iPhone. What? Why? Who would ever do so? Oh, that's so insane. That is so absolutely nuts. I have no words. Recently, Worn & Wound put out an article discussing the actual problem of fakes, and it's not quite what you would expect. So the author discusses their opinion. There's no real numbers behind this, but their opinion that the problem of fakes is nowhere near as vast or huge or problematic as us watch YouTubers would have people think. This opinion was formed around the idea that you don't really hear a whole lot of horror stories about people being taken by fakes. You hear a lot of discussion about fakes, but not so many of the horror stories. So his hypothesis is it doesn't happen a whole lot, generally. However, the area where fakes are rampant is in the area of vintage watches. And he proceeds to make the case that redialing vintage watches and fixing up cases on them is horrible, because you're erasing history and basically defacing vintage watches. What do I think of this? I'm a little bit torn, because I understand his points about erasing history and basically altering something from the past. However, I own some watches that have been restored like that, namely my pull router, and I don't mind it at all. But I do see his point. However, I don't think it's the tragedy that he makes it out to be, simply because there are tons of watches out there that aren't restored. I mean, just look for A11s on eBay, and they are definitely not restored. They are beat up and obviously have seen war. It reminds me of ancient buildings. So I recently went out of town for a bit, and my wife and I encountered an antique building that had been restored to look like it did back in its heyday. And the beauty is not all buildings are like that. You can actually go and see buildings that are in their old, unfixed up state. However, you can also encounter buildings like this one that were restored, and you can see what it was like way back when, back in its glory days. And that's where I am with a lot of vintage watches. I would like to see a pull router like it was when you get it brand new. But on the other hand, it is great seeing a watch where its long life is played out all over the surface of the watch. But for me personally, that's almost sad. It's like a tired, worn out thing that's been around for decades and decades. I would like to see it in its glory days when it first came out of the box. And so in my opinion, I don't want to see all vintage watches restored, but I think it's cool, like homages, to have options. If we do want to see some of these old watches because we love the aesthetic, but we want to see them like they were back then when they were brand new, it's cool that there are people out there that are restoring pieces like this. But that's just my opinion. Probably unpopular. But what can you do? Thanks for watching.